In today's video, I'm going to be giving this vintage ottoman a shabby chic treatment to look like this. And the very first thing I have to do is I have to remove the seat from the frame. And even though it's an ottoman, I still call that a slip seat. First thing I do is I have to take the old fabric off, and I am using a staple puller to get that off. These staples were probably put in by a handheld stapler, so they're pretty easy to get off, get out. The ones that we put in with the electric staple gun are a little bit harder to get out. So once we get this whole cover off, we discover, as usual, that there is another cover underneath it. When people redid their own furniture, they basically would put one cover over another cover and not remove too much because it's a lot of work and it can be real dirty to take off the old cover. And also, it may look like a screwdriver, but it's a very different tool, and people don't often have the exact tools that are necessary to reupholster their furniture. So now we have a second cover to remove, and this cover has nails. It was nailed on, so it's much older, probably didn't have a staple gun at the time. So we take this one off with a nail puller, and once I have all of those nails off, I carefully throw all that stuff in the garbage. You do not want to get those staples or those nails anywhere near your feet or your hands. They're very sharp. I decided I'm going to leave this pink cloth cover on the slip seat. And what I'm going to do is I am just going to cover it with a real thick piece of Dacron. I am going to use my electric pneumatic staple gun. I'm going to cut away as much of the corner as I possibly can and as much of the excess along the edges because I want the seat to sit pretty straight and pretty tightly on top of the frame. So I don't want to have big bulges of stuff. So I'm going to cut as much of it away as I can as I'm stapling it. And then it's time to work on the frame. The frame on this particular ottoman was in pretty good shape, so I scuff sanded it a little bit with a 180 sandpaper. And then I wiped it back to get any of the dust off of it before I was ready to paint it. And I am using a chalk synthesis paint from Wise Owl to paint this ottoman. I am using a color called Antique Vela, and I'm painting the whole thing first coat and then letting that dry, and then I'm going to go ahead and put a second coat on. After 2 coats of paint were totally dry, I went ahead and took a 220 piece of sandpaper and I lightly sanded it because I am going for a shabby chic look. So after we sanded it, distressed it a little bit, it's time to just put on a clear coat of furniture wax and set it aside as we get ready to do the fabric top. I'm using a heavy white linen. It's got lots of texture. First thing I'm going to do is I'm misting the fabric before I paint on a fabric medium. And what the fabric medium does is it seals the fabric a little bit, and it also helps it to remain pliable after I paint it. So I'm painting all of the area that I believe that I'm going to put my paint inlay on, and then I'm going to let it dry, and it takes quite a while to dry. So that is priming and letting it dry. I am using the Delft Traditions paint inlay from IOD. It is 8 pages of different blue and white motifs, and the one I am using is kind of like a gingham fabric. It's just blue and white, little white blue flowers on a white ground. And the inlay are 12 by 16, and I'm just going to put it right in the middle. once I add my coat of chalk paint. It might be a little difficult to see exactly what I'm doing because I am painting white paint onto white fabric, but I am going to give a really thorough coat of white chalk synthesis paint across this whole piece of fabric. Everywhere where I've already painted with the um, fabric medium, I am now going to paint with chalk paint. So far, using a paint inlay on fabric hasn't been much different than using a paint inlay on wood. I'm doing the same thing. I'm making sure that I have a real even coat of paint, and I want my paint to be pretty wet without being super soggy. And I want it to stay pretty wet, so I'm trying to keep it wet, and then I am ready to put on the inlay. And I'm taking my one sheet of paint inlay, which is, like I said, 12 inches by 16 inches, and I'm going to press it right into the wet paint. Keep it taut and get it where I want it, and then press it in. And once I've got it all pressed in, I'm going to really push down on it to get it where I want it. Then I am going to start dampening it with a wet rag. And for this application, I got it a little too wet, and I did get some flow blue where my blue paint bled a little bit into the white background. Once it was all dampened, I do the same thing that I would do on any application with a paint inlay. I let it dry, let it thoroughly dry, and it took a long time for the fabric to actually be thoroughly dry so that I could remove the paint inlay paper. And then once it's thoroughly dry, you spritz it with water again to dampen the paper and get it to release. And then I slowly pulled it away from the fabric. And as you can see, it came out perfectly. It had, like I said, a little bit of place where the paint had bled a little bit because I put so much water on that it actually went through the paper or it went under the paper. I'm not sure which, but it did not do anything to not make the finished look be exactly what I wanted, a shabby chic footstool with a paint inlay. Next step, upholster the footstool top with the fabric. So I center it, flip it over, and start stapling it down. And again, I'm going to remove as much bulk as I can get out of the corners and along the edges so that I am able to get my ottoman frame and this seat cover as close to each other as I possibly can. Last step is to screw the seat top back down to the frame. And I super carefully line up the holes so that they are in the exact same spot. And then it's just a matter of screwing them in and getting them as tight as I possibly can. And then we flip our ottoman over and it is ready for use. And here it is, all set. I did wax the top of the fabric with a furniture wax, and it came out super soft and wonderful, and it feels just like leather now. Blue and white is one of my favorite combinations for colors and design. And I was able to pick up another one of those suitcases, and I haven't done a suitcase in a year. So my next project is going to be this suitcase.